you got a question to you personally that you wanted to address. So, to
What
Dutch
was
and
it about?
James. I'm sorry?
Go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead. Read that.
Oh, so it's from Sean. Now I'm going to blow this surname. McAuliffe, I think. Sean McAuliffe, let's say.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
From Abbeville, Alabama.
Yeah.
I've heard you being Dutch, talk about starting out in the wrestling business years ago. So who mentored you along the way or helped you navigate the business? Who were some of your mentors when you started? And we've read how much the business was so different years ago than you see today. When you started, how many companies were in business? Well, we know that in the dozens. And how did you get into contact with them because there were no dirt sheets going back that far? Okay, so 2 questions there. Who were your mentors getting into the business?
Well, the guy who hired me when I started work in Atlanta a lifetime ago, he was the lead member of the infamous Assassins, the Masked Assassins team, Tom Ernesto, and he was the first guy that booked me. And so I may have told this story before, but I used to ride with him a lot, and the reason I would rode with him because we would take his car, and he had a big Cadillac, and I would drive the car, and he would sit over there and talk to me. But during those trips is I called Wrestling 101 because I got more knowledge from that guy just riding with him and listening to him and listening to his stories than I could have got in a wrestling school in 2 years. So he would tell me to do this and don't do that. And he would tell me how the formula to put a match together, and he was good on storytelling too. So, and I was usually on first every night. So I would go out there, and what I would do, I would go out there and with this guy called Ted Oates. He's passed away now, great worker. But I would go out there with Ted Oates, and I'd always go a 15-minute Broadway, which meant time limit draw. But in those 15 minutes, I learned more with that guy, and he learned more with me. It was almost we were teaching each other the business at the same time, and neither one of us knew what we were doing. We just kept moving. And I'd get back in the car, and Tom he would pick the match apart, and we would go from there. So every guy I ever rode with became a mentor type. Like Ox Baker. That's where I got the mustache idea from. I used to ride with Ox, and he didn't have much of a formula, but he was entertaining as hell. So we would start out on a trip, and he'd go, and he'd do his mustache like this. And I was always in awe of his mustache. And you can see some pictures of him. You know, he had that big black mustache, and he was a hell of a heel. And like Skandor Akbar, I learned from him, riding up and down the road with him. So I would ride with all these different people, and they would not necessarily mentor me so much as I would just listen to them. And that was how I learned the business. See, back in those days when I started, they were like 30 companies, and I was so dumb. I didn't think there were any other companies out of the South. I knew that the Carolinas had a company there. Georgia had one because I'd worked in Florida. And then I found out Alabama had 2. I went, what? Alabama has 2 companies? I didn't know that. Then I found out Louisiana has 1. What? And Texas has 2 or maybe 3. I didn't know that. And then I found out Buffalo, New York had 1. And New York had 1. And all these companies in Minneapolis, they had a company. Chicago had a company. And Indiana, not India, I think it was Indiana. Dick the Bruiser, he had a company. Then you go up to Oregon, California had 2, and that's not even counting your Canadian territories. So anybody back in those days, if you could half-ass just work at all, you could really just pick up the phone and get booked somewhere. If that's all you want to do is work, didn't necessarily mean that you were going to make any kind of money, but you'd make a living and you get to travel around. And that's what we all did years and years and years ago. So, we were talking about journeyman moving around. That's what we did. So, and the question is, he said, did he say, how did you get in touch with these companies? Did he?
Yeah, I imagine you just
Yeah.
recommended, weren't you, from one promoter to
Yeah,
another?
it was just word of mouth. And you'd get the number from them. This was before the internet. This is before the Dave Meltzers. This was before way back. So you get the number to the office, and you call up and you talk to a guy, and he'd say, and we didn't have anything called like videotape. We didn't have that. That's too damn highfalutin. I mean, that was too high class for us. You just send some pictures, stock pictures, and the guy would either book you or he wouldn't book you.
That's a good question, actually. So, like in today, is the different forms in different decades. So today you can just forward to some indie promoter a link to a show reel or a match or whatever. Earlier days, you could send in a videotape and some 8x10s.
Mm-hmm.
When you broke into the business in the 70s, did you send in, for the most part, anything? Or was it only word of mouth and someone vouching for
No,
you?
you sent in 8x10s.
Yeah. So you actually you would introduce yourself. Would you have like a cover letter or something, who you were, that kind of thing?
Yeah, you'd have a cover letter and say, I'm interested in, my name is this, and you give your physical stats and how long you've been in the business and where you've been working, and if you have any references like anything else, and you're interested in, you could, if the guy could use you, you appreciate a call back from him. You give him your number and you go from there. And sometimes you get a call back, sometimes you wouldn't. But your pictures stayed there the whole time. So who knows? Somebody gets hurt, or one of the underneath guys, you need somebody, and the guy looks over, no, he just sees your picture. Well, I'll call this guy. A lot of guys got booked that way. But you got to make yourself available first. Then you got to, the guy would call you up, and then y'all would work out a deal. And see, if you were unproven, you didn't get anything like a guarantee that you were going to make X number of dollars. But the understanding was you had to make enough to make a living, or you couldn't stay. You'd have to go somewhere else or get a job. And since I had a job aversion, I didn't want to get a job, so I just stayed with it. But it was a totally different business. Believe me, totally different.
I don't think I've ever asked you this. So we've talked about briefly the very first times you got into wrestling, not, with Ted Oates and Georgia and that thing. Before you got into the army, before you were drafted, you did a few indie shows here and there. And I think it was your older brother who got you into wrestling. So we established it was around 68, 69, something like that. How did you get your very, very first gig? Was it through your brother? And how did your brother get that gig to get you on the card?
Okay, I was working, this before I went into the army, and I was working on these cards with a friend of my brother, and his name was Doug, a big guy. He was about 6'7", about 400. So he actually started working in Georgia because he was from Georgia. And he started working there before I did. So when I got out of the army, Doug, and I'd only had, I don't know, 5 or 8, no more, matches. And he wanted to know, would I be interested in coming over there to Georgia? I was in the Carolinas, and starting work with his company. And I said, well, I guess. So he set up a meeting with the booker of the territory at that time, Tom Ernesto, who became one of my mentors, and walked in the office, and he never saw me work, never. And he hired me on the spot. And he said, all right. But the first time they they tried me out. I think they gave me like a tryout spot, and it was in way as far south as you could go in Georgia. I think it was Waycross, Georgia. I think. And he sent me, I mean, it was on the ocean, I remember. And he sent me down there, and it was like July. And I had, this is probably 71, 72, no, about 72, early, and summertime too, maybe, yeah, 72. And I rode down there in that southern heat for 4 hours, and it was like 100 degrees outside that day. I like to have died on that trip, and got down there and then had a match. And then he called me up. He said, "Ah, they said you worked okay." And he said, then he gave me so you start Monday or the next Monday. And they used to have like, regular towns, like, Monday was Augusta, and then Columbus was Wednesday, and Atlanta was Friday. And then they had Carrollton, Georgia and these were small towns. I mean, Augusta had a pretty big building. Columbus had a pretty big building. And you would make these towns every week. So, and that's how I broke into the business.
One last question to end it on, then we'll shut down this podcast, is, I don't think I've ever asked you this either. What was the first show that you booked or co-booked, or at least gave ideas for the booking?
I'd have to think about that.
Do you remember the territory?
Well, I'm sure it was Tennessee, because anybody can have an idea about what to do next. Sometimes you just go to the booker and said, "Hey, where are we going with this?" Or "What kind of idea do you have?" And he said, "Well, I was going to talk to you about." That's the time to throw your idea at him. And I wouldn't suggest for anybody just to go start throwing ideas at something you saw on Raw or something you saw on SmackDown. But it has to make sense and not be too extreme. Or back in those days, you couldn't be too extreme. Now you can. But I think it was the Randy Savage angle that I worked in Tennessee. We were both heels. I've told you this before.
This is the Goulas.
Yeah, this was with Goulas. And he told me, he said, "Listen, we're both heels. We're going nowhere," because we had no baby faces to work with. He said, "Why don't you turn baby face and I'll work with you?" I said, "No, why don't you turn baby face and I'll work with you?" He said, No. He said, I'm not good at a baby. I don't want to be a baby face. I said, "Okay." So I turned, and the whole summer I went with Randy, and business improved like more than 100%. It improved 150%. Because the first time I went to Nashville, it was some little fairground building. I doubt if they had 200 people in there. And it would only seat maybe 800. But by the time we went by a month, we had 800 people in that building.
Okay, but so one of you suggested you go babyface, essentially.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
But that's a suggestion to turn you. What was the first angle you actually booked that was yours then? So did you start actually booking your own storylines with Randy at that point?
Well, I helped out quite a bit. The first time I really booked was in Puerto Rico. Everything was mine.
Well, you did it in Florida beforehand, I know that. And
I did do it in Florida too. Excuse me.
So who vouched for you as a booker then?
Who's this?
Who vouched for you to take the book then?
Jerry Jarrett.
So he said, you must have given enough suggestions to convince him that you'd be good at it.
I did. I hope I did. Well, I used to ride with him too. We would ride to Memphis, and he would say, "What would you do?" And he used to ride with Lawler. Lawler said, "What would you do here?" And I throw an idea at him, and he'd either take it or reject it, but without any animosity. He said, I don't think that to be the right thing. We were just talking about it. And Jerry Jarrett, I do the same thing on some of those long trips. And he gave me the philosophy. So did Jerry Lawler. Gave me the philosophy of basic booking. Excuse me. And that's how I learned it. And Jerry Jarrett taught me to tell the story. He was the first one to tell me you got to tell a story and make everything personal. He said, what you want to do as a babyface is you want to bring those fans with you. So if the fans put themselves in your place, how would they feel? And that's when you get the emotion. And I took that to Puerto Rico. In Puerto Rico, I worked some angles. Those people are very hot-tempered and emotional to begin with. That's what they are. I would have them crying in the crowd because I would take a guy and I would beat him half the way to Christmas. And he'd be bloody and nobody would help him and the people crying, help, help, help. But you got to watch that because that's what they call white heat. And if you get that white heat too much, it's very dangerous heat. There's a difference between heat and white heat. When they kind of get quiet and they're looking at you, they're thinking about killing you. Mm-hmm. And so you want to get out of there before it gets to that point. But that's a little bit of a thing I learned a long time ago. I was in Augusta and Tom Ernesto. He said, you hear those people? And I went, they're not doing nothing. He said, exactly. You know what that's called, kid? I said, what? White heat. Those heels should be here right now and they come in the door. Because you get away from them. It's called white heat. It's hotter than this regular heat. And I would have no idea what he was talking about unless he was pointing it out to me right then. And still, I can tell you about it, but you still don't really know what it is. It's just a term, and I've never heard the term, but a couple of times in wrestling, white heat. That's when the fans are hotter than hot, they're right before they're going to jump in the ring. So you got to get out of there before they reach that point. But see, people ask me, how do I become a booker? And I said, oh God, you don't want to be a booker. Oh yeah, I do. Yeah, I do. Because everybody can have a good idea. But when you start taking those ideas and you're a booker for a territory, you don't have that now. You have creative teams. But you got to have these ideas all through the year. You got to have it 52 times a year and keep that machine rolling, because when that machine breaks, the fans don't come for a week, 3 weeks, then you're losing money because you can't pay people, not on those small houses. You really can't pay people enough to stay. Now, Tony Khan can, because he's a billionaire. He can do that. So, and I hope he's paying those guys a lot of money.
He is.
But he is also, and he's been described as he wants to play real life chess. That's what he's doing. So, and he just loves the business so much, but he can do that because his family can afford it. So, and Jeff, if he called me up today, Jeff Jarrett, we were talking about him buying TNA. He knows what he wants to do anyway. But I would say, man, remember last time, what happened last time? Because that machine can break at any time. Just because you got a TV contract don't mean you're going to have it next year. So you got to keep that you got it. The wrestling machine keeps eating. You can't fatten it up because it's going to keep eating more and more and more and more. You remember you talking about the WCW years,
mm-hmm.
And then they had all these great years, and all of a sudden, what happened? What happened? Why'd you stop watching it?
Oh, they went, okay. There's a number of reasons.
They started repeating, or what?
Yeah, that's maybe one of the first reasons, that they set into creative bankruptcy, and they had the same finish pretty much every single week on Nitro, is that the NWO would run in, and then the NWO would run in the next week. Very occasionally, the baby faces would stand tall at the end, but there's so much NWO. Creative bankruptcy set in first, then just the nonsensical stuff started setting in, the unsatisfying stuff, and then very quick, and then the visual stuff where they changed all the sets and it looked so ugly. And then it became a presentational issue, and then just everything compounded between the end of '98 and the end of '99. There was such a stark difference with the product. It didn't resemble what it was a year earlier, and they managed to kill off basically the drawing power of every single person who was drawing like crazy just 12 months earlier. A downfall in wrestling has never been seen like that.
Well, it can happen, believe me, because I've been in territories before and all of a sudden it's going great. You lose one guy, you lose two guys, you're done for a while. You got to rebuild. When I took over Florida, Dusty was the booker. He went to the Carolinas. He took everybody who was anybody, which is himself, basically. He was the top draw in Florida. And when he removed himself, he took Magnum TA with him. He took Barry Windham with him. He took one of the Russians with him. So he pulled out everything that he'd been drawing with, and he took it all to Charlotte. And when I got there, I looked out there and I said, damn, what happened? Because I was going to have to rebuild the whole crew. And I went in there about, I don't know, September. And it took me to Christmas to get it halfway up and running. And then I had Flair a couple of shots. I brought him in. And Michael Hayes come in, so I had the Freebirds. Now we're starting to build a little bit, rebuild. And finally I had it up. And I remember my last house there before I gave my notice was Orlando, and it didn't sell out. Orlando was a big building, but it was like an old farm building, but it was a big building. So we probably had 1,500 people in there, I guess. Then the unthinkable happened. Eddie Graham killed himself. And from that point on, I just couldn't continue there anymore. I said, no, I was stressed out. And then Eddie, he became a mentor when I was there. And he owned part of the territory. So when Eddie took his life, I was done. I was gone out of there in about 10 days.